So thanks so much for joining us today in our explorations in large systems complex change. This webinar is one in a series that has grown out of a special issue of the Journal of Corporate Citizenship on this topic of large systems complex change, wanting to further advance our understanding about how to address large challenges. I'm Steve Waddell. I'm your host. I was lead editor of that special issue, and I work on large systems complex change issues. I'm based here in Boston, where it's a hot and sweltery day today. So there's not probably a better issue for large systems change than the issue of peace and peacemaking and conflict resolution. And we have a really wonderful example here of working on that issue, Generations with Peace, with Mark Clark, who's the CEO of that initiative. Mark, welcome. And maybe you would like to begin by introducing yourself first.
Steve, thank you very much. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to be part of this really interesting group and the journey that you're on, Steve, with a merry band of people. So, yeah, I'm CEO of Generations for Peace, which is a non-profit peace-building organization that is based in Jordan, Amman. But we work through volunteer-led actions in 50 countries in the Middle East, in parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe, especially Balkans and Caucasus regions of Europe. And our work is really looking to support volunteers to address very local issues of conflict and violence in their own communities, issues that they are really passionate about. And in so many different countries, of course, those issues take different forms. So we have a variety ranging from interreligious violence, into tribal violence or clan-related violence, into ethnic violence and generally ethno-political violence, but also issues of structural violence, discrimination, marginalization, exclusion of people in communities. They may be refugees or displaced people. They might be people with a disability. And then we very often are supporting volunteers to address gender-based violence or issues of gender inequality. So a whole range of different issues in our different countries. But I think the main synergy across all our programs is that they are volunteer-led and that they are locally demand-driven programs. And so our work as a small headquarters team here in Jordan is really to support and empower those volunteers. We do that through training, through a peace building and conflict transformation curriculum that we have. And then really the training is only the beginning of a long journey where we walk in step with them and mentor them through their program design, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and successive cycles of programs that go through adaptive and emergent changes over time. And so what I'd really like to do today is, in the webinar, is to just give one example of a story and to see if we can use that example just to illustrate some of the principles that we found from our work that appear to be useful in addressing really complex, wicked problems, and to see then, hopefully with some questions and answers and discussion, whether some of this may resonate with other people who are also working and wrestling with very complex changes. So you'll see.
Can I just pause for a moment? I see that Peter Van Tuyl has joined us. Peter, how are you? Can you speak today? Your microphone working?
My microphone, I hope, is this working?
It is indeed. Thank you.
Okay. I have to forewarn you, I had another time for this webinar scheduled. So I will have to cut out very soon.
Okay, I'm sorry to
I'm
hear
sorry
that.
about that, but because it's my turn next week. But that was my fault, I think. Not
Okay,
Steve.
I also actually need to leave a little bit earlier.
okay. So we will condense this, perhaps, Mark.
I can manage that. Don't worry, no problem.
Okay.
Perhaps if we jump straight into the story, it begins with this location called we're going to call Camp K. I won't disclose its real name because I don't want to disclose the precise location or the identity of our volunteers working there, but it may become obvious to some of you. And in Camp K, we're really understanding that we're dealing with this situation when an A to Z approach doesn't appear to work. So here is a few images of Camp K. It's one of the largest refugee camps in the world, and it contains families from different tribes who are in conflict with each other in the surrounding region. They fled their homes amidst intense and protracted fighting, and so they're all together in Camp K. Now, as I mentioned, I work for a peace-building organization, and one of our volunteers lives in this country, lives very close to the camp. And he was, having been trained by us and worked on some other programs locally, was really seeing an important opportunity to do some programs in the camp, not only to tackle issues of conflict inside the camp itself, but really to think ahead and to try to transform relationships and capacities to manage conflict so that perhaps these could be transferred to the broader region when people eventually returned home. So we'll call this volunteer Ali. Ali initially planned a really ambitious program. He wanted to engage the tribal chiefs in the camp and through them to work with male youth from each of the tribes and with them to run carefully facilitated sport-based activities. This is part of our method for conflict transformation. And these sport-based activities integrate peace-building objectives and peace-building education. And so the objectives are not about developing sports skills, but they're about bringing people together in a particular facilitated experience where they can break stereotypes and foster greater understanding and trust between each other. So Ali's detailed A to Z plan, complete with a set of activities gradually increasing in complexity and with a detailed budget for a whole year's worth of programming and complete with all the indicators to monitor different outputs and outcomes and impact. As he completed his plan and drove to the camp, he was really excited and he felt confident and ready. And of course, the problem was upon arrival at the camp with this plan, he was refused access even to enter the camp and to meet with the tribal chiefs. Now, he's from the same province. He is a local in that respect, and he could see a clear need for the program. But all of his overtures and inquiries were simply met with disinterest and suspicion. The camp officials really saw no apparent need for peace building, and he was unable really even to have a chance to deliver his full presentation about what his program was all about, this presentation that he had rehearsed so much. So really right at the first step, Ali felt that his nice A to Z plan had simply hit a brick wall. And he was a bit confused by this. He wondered why the camp officials didn't share his own sense of the urgent needs in the camp and couldn't appreciate his offer of help and assistance. But at least he was able to reflect on that experience and to let go of his A to Z plan and to reflect that perhaps a different approach was needed. And he realized really his first task was simply to work out a way to gain entry into the camp and to begin to build relationships. And so he identified child health as a priority of concern to the refugees and the camp officials. And so he began by supporting a new health program for children and mothers in the camp. And this program was very popular and it grew very quickly with the support of the camp authorities. And Ali trained more and more volunteers to work in this program. And both he and his volunteers became well known in the different tribal areas. And he began to have access to the different sectors within the camp that were dominated by different tribes. But at this stage, he still had no access directly to the tribal chiefs. And most of the families in the camp were actually headed by women, because so many men had been killed in the fighting or were still fighting or had stayed behind to protect their property. And so Ali had a unique opportunity as a male volunteer in the camp, really to have access to the mothers through the health program. And he learned from them that what they really wanted most of all was regular activities for their children, so that they themselves would have more time to devote to production of handicrafts that they could sell to earn income. And so this was the opportunity that Ali saw to introduce his planned sports activities. So he trained some more volunteers, and these volunteers began sport-based activities for the boys in the camp. Of course, cricket being a favorite sport in this particular part of the world. It began with activities just for the boys from one tribe, and then it very quickly spread as people from the other tribes and the other tribal chiefs saw this activity, saw that one tribe was benefiting from it, and very quickly asked if it could be brought for their tribe also to benefit from and participate in. Now, the sport-based games allowed the mothers time for income generation activities, and it provided new opportunities for the boys from different tribes to try out different sports. Here you've got volleyball, to meet each other, to break stereotypes, and to begin to foster new relationships across tribal divides in a very safe, carefully facilitated environment.
Mark, in these examples, would these boys be on tribal-based teams, or would they mix the teams?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because it's really important that the competitive nature of these sport-based activities is still used. It's that competitive nature that is what excites people and provides that superordinate goal. But you don't have community A or tribe A playing community B or tribe B. You mix the teams so that the superordinate goal becomes precisely what drives that interdependency of cooperation. And that's what begins to foster new relationships and ways of working. So it's a really good question. Very often we're asked if we simply do away with the competitive nature of the sport altogether. But I think if you do that, then you lose some of the power and some of the real value of the dynamics of sport. So the teams you're seeing with the volleyball, they are mixed teams, different tribes all together on the same team. Yeah, great question.
Your approach is really a cultural approach, right? And it's about how to build, shift the culture and the relationships around cultural interaction.
Yeah, I think we have an idea in our mind that with our different activities, we tend to be addressing personal capacities and relationships. Both things are inputs into sustained behavior change. So yes, in that sense, it's social programming, it's behavior change programming, but very often we understand our peace building work as being about reducing forms of violence, and really we're trying to dig really deep to cultural forms of violence. Cultural violence being based around identities, being based around narratives that are part of an identity group through which they learn about which group they belong to and which they don't, through which they learn about what behavior is acceptable and what's not, the sorts of narratives that you learn as you grow up through bedtime stories, through listening to your grandparents or your parents, also through reading the media and really learning within your own social setting, your identity group, who are the role models, what behavior is celebrated, what behavior is punished, what behavior is rewarded, and so on. And these cultural narratives are also appearing in cultural artifacts, so songs, anthems, literature, music, and so on. So as these cultural narratives get passed on from generation to generation, very often the cultural violence within them is about differentiating between identity groups, which can then lend itself to justification or normalization of violence of other forms towards those groups. So structural violence, exclusion, discrimination, or even direct violence. So an extreme example of that would be, say, 1994 in Rwanda with Hutu Power Radio describing Tutsis as cockroaches. So that cultural narrative being promulgated over radio over and over and over and over again, dehumanizing the other. That's a cultural narrative leading to cultural violence, which in turn can amazingly easily normalize and justify, legitimize very, very serious and widespread direct violence of a horrific scale, as we know. So that's just one particular example. But you're right that it's at its roots, it's about cultural violence. So I think I'll keep going because the story continues that over several months, there was gradual behavior change in the boys. This behavior change was well observed by the different tribal chiefs. And the tribal chiefs also received very positive feedback from the mothers about their increased income from their income generation activities. And so at the request of the mothers, and having gained the acceptance of the tribal chiefs, Ali discussed the possibility of introducing sports activities for girls also, and something which was completely prohibited hitherto in a very conservative local culture. Now, at first, the chiefs, and you can see some of them sitting there, at first they were very resistant, and they gave several reasons to Ali why this simply was not possible. They would have to, the activities would have to be facilitated only by females. They'd have to be conducted out of the sight of men. Sports activities should not require females to wear immodest clothing, and so on. So Ali listened to each of their objections and then offered solutions for each one in turn. And eventually 2 of the chiefs, out of 12 tribes in the camp, 2 of the chiefs agreed to a pilot demonstration. And so for the demonstration, Ali trained some female volunteers, and they facilitated very simple sport-based games for girls. And you can see in the pictures, canvas sheets were strung up between the tents to create a perimeter, to create an area enclosed, large enough for group activity, but out of sight of men. And for this demonstration, a range of activities were shown, and the chiefs were so impressed with it that they relented. And at first, in 2 tribes, and then gradually over time, the other tribes joining, more and more girls began to participate in these sport-based games from all the different tribal sectors in the camp.
And did they, the chiefs, when they were welcoming this to expand it, was it around their vision of peace and conflict as being the issue? Was that something that was up front for them, or was that more secondary somehow?
No, very, very much secondary, not really explicit at all. And I think throughout the whole narrative of Ali's journey, it was almost counterproductive to discuss these activities as being explicitly to do with peace building or conflict transformation. That may have been the tacit objective, but really Ali kind of threw away the explicit program and was really just responding step by step to what people in the community were saying were their priorities. So for the chief, hearing that the mothers were really happy with those activities for boys, and that, if there could be activities for girls also, there would be even more time for the mothers to have income generation activities. And the chiefs also seeing there was a positive benefit in the behavior change amongst the boys and the girls. That was a good result for them. It wasn't explicitly the intent of the chiefs that this was all about supporting better relations between the tribes, but they saw that happening and they were pleased with it when they saw it.
So was it framed primarily as development activities, or how was it framed then?
It was really framed in response to the request from the mothers. So it's kind of
Right.
the boys' activities were simply offered in response to the mothers saying, one thing we struggle with is we don't have time. We've got to look after the kids, that we don't have any other male family members to go and work or to look after children. So we are faced with the double burden of income generation and looking after the children. We could do much more income generation if somebody's taking care of the children part of the time.
So it was presented more almost like a practical solution to a practical problem.
Very much so, very much so. And I think Ali found that, he was surprised by this as well, because when he first went to the camp, he was thinking, I've got a peace building program because I can see that there are real conflicts in this camp. And surely the people in the camp and the tribal leaders especially must be very concerned about that. But nobody was really, for them, the conflict was outside the camp explicitly. They weren't really willing to admit that there was conflict inside the camp, although there was conflict manifesting itself in all sorts of different ways between the tribes. So, we have no problem here. We have no conflict here is a very often a response if you kind of walk into a community and say we have a conflict transformation program. It's counterproductive.
Okay.
So this process moving from the health program to the boys' activities and then the girls' sports activities took place over 2 years, and it eventually gained Ali access to the tribal chiefs on a more personal level. And so he was able then to begin to engage the tribal chiefs in more substantive dialogue himself, and then to begin to listen to their hopes and dreams for the future, and to work with them together, sitting together, which didn't happen very often before, to break down barriers and begin to talk about building bridges between the different tribal groups. So that happened when the readiness emerged. And by making it a tacit objective and not pushing for it explicitly, Ali was able to get there. And he's absolutely certain he would never have got there if he had tried to push. Indeed, he would never really have had even the opportunity to get there. So our work in communities is really supporting volunteers like Ali to lead change and to cascade change with other volunteers to address really local issues in their communities. And it's important to understand, as volunteers, they lack authority or power. They can't command change or really dictate it. So their work is really as change agents in their community, and about being really honest with themselves about where they have influence and what are the limits on their influence, and to what extent can they support the conditions for change to emerge, rather than having any explicit power to force change to happen. So I think from that little story, I just want to share some of the lessons that we've learned along the way from similar stories in many other communities around the world. And the first lesson is that the system makes sense to itself. And if we think back to Ali at the beginning of his story, he couldn't understand why the camp officials didn't share his sense of urgency or didn't see the benefit of his proposed program. And so I think we need to reflect on the fact that when we encounter a new system, whether it's a community or whether it's an organization, when we encounter a new system for the first time, there may be many aspects of its behavior that in our eyes may seem absurd or irrational. And we may even say to ourselves, you know, this organization or this community is completely dysfunctional. But I think it's important for us to remember that actually the system is functioning perfectly according to its own dynamics. And even a terrible situation of protracted violence is nonetheless a stable, functioning system with forces in equilibrium sustaining it. And really the system makes perfect sense to itself, even if it doesn't yet make sense to us. And so our first task in entering a new system is really to try to build relationships within it and to broaden and deepen our understanding of it. So that brings us to the second lesson that we like to talk about, which is this famous quote from George Box that all models are wrong, some models are useful. And so we actually take that a step further and think, well, then it leads us to think that multiple models are even more useful. And we try to suspend our preconceptions and our worldview and to embrace multiple perspectives about what may be going on in this new system. And we understand that each model is wrong. It's only a model. It doesn't reflect reality exactly or precisely. But each model might be a useful metaphor. And as a metaphor, it might provide us some sort of useful insight. So the more of those insights we can collect, perhaps the deeper our understanding may be. And I just want to share 3 models very briefly that we found to be consistently useful in quite different contexts. And you might consider, you know, could they apply in your own organizations or your own communities or situations? The first one is all about transformative dialogue. It's a particular mode for dialogue to address conflict. But it begins with lots and lots of cups of tea or coffee, or depending on the culture, perhaps even vodka or different forms of alcohol. So very much social settings where you're having lots and lots of conversations to try to get clear answers from many different perspectives to the questions: who needs to talk to whom, about what, why, and how? Because those questions will lead you to build up a really rich picture of what is going on in the community and what are the issues that actually need some sort of discussion or dialogue. The second model we found really interesting and kind of insightful is the 5 colors model. And we've put the 5 pairs of glasses there, the 5 kind of sets of lenses through which you can look at the world. And each one helps us think through the political aspects of a situation, political with a small p. So who has the power? What are the relationships between people, different levels of authority or status or different alliances and allegiances? Secondly, the blue one, what's the rational perspective? What's the blueprint for kind of planned change based on data, very much an engineering or architect's blueprint kind of mindset. Then the red one, all about personal motivation, red being the color of kind of blood and emotions. The green one, thinking through learning. How do we learn? How do people learn new behaviors? How do people capture new knowledge? How do they transfer that knowledge? What are the feedback loops possible to generate collective learning? And what sort of practices are there for experimentation? So green as a certain mode for change. And then the last one is white. And this is much more abstract in some ways, as the color suggests. And it's around systems dynamics and deeper values and sense making in a situation. So we found it's quite useful to use the 5 colors model and kind of just go through them in sequence and just think, what insights has that process given me about a particular situation? And then the third one I'll share tonight is just, we call it 4 dimensions of conflict. Personal dimension, relational dimension, structural dimension, and cultural dimension. And again, we find that this is a really helpful way just to think through different issues of conflict and violence in a community and to categorize them in some way. And we find that all three of these models, actually, you can use them both descriptively first to gain a deeper understanding of the situation in a community, and then you can reuse them a second time, but prescriptively, to start taking some decisions about which aspect you may begin to prioritize to work on. The next lesson I want to touch on is, I guess, in the title of the webinar also. So a straight line is not the answer. Forget A to Z. And so what we've learned in our peace building work is that big ambitious plans, like the plan Ali began with, always hit a brick wall. The types of change we're looking at are addressing wicked, complex problems, and they're not amenable to this technical, planned, linear approach to change that would be the perfect approach in a more technical kind of engineering type, blue type environment. And so if we can focus, instead of focusing on A to Z, if we can simply focus on A to B and then learn and adapt, that's a much more productive mode for us to be operating in. And it starts really by admitting we don't fully understand the system. And that means we should give up pretending that we understand the whole system and that we can plan ahead as far as A to Z and just let go of all of that. And that allows us, it can be quite liberating actually, because it allows you then to just focus on the more immediate achievable objectives. And so I guess an example of that is when Ali's first step failed, he threw away his A to Z plan and just thought, well, what's A to B? What's the most immediate priority that people are telling me in the camp they would really like some help with? And let's do that really well. And the B was, health programming for mothers and their children. And having arrived at B, having executed the health program to a good degree of success, then things have changed. He's built some new relationships, some new knowledge, and some new opportunities have emerged. And so having arrived at B, he's now able to scan the environment again and see, there's a new objective that I can work on now, and that objective is C. And that was the sports activities for boys. And so really it's an emergent kind of stepping stone approach where you don't know what the next stone will be at the beginning, and you don't have all the stones from A to Z mapped out. And you're really able then to seize those emergent opportunities. And I guess, at the beginning of Ali's program, it wasn't in his plan at all to address gender inequality or to try to empower girls and women. But through his adaptive approach, he ended up doing that through the sports-based activities for girls. And that was a major cultural shift, that girls were allowed to participate in sports-based activities. So when we let go of the A to Z plan, we can also let go of the impulse to change the system. And we start local, we are persistent, as Ali was throughout his entire story, and we try to work to reach a tipping point of support. And you'll remember at a few points in Ali's story, he started small, just with one tribe or with a couple of tribes, and then it begins to build a momentum as other people demand that the program is expanded to their own tribal area. Now, this idea of local action is an idea expressed in Gareth Morgan's research that predicts an individual can only have direct influence on 15% of the world around them. And he argues that's the case whether you're Barack Obama or a young volunteer in a refugee camp. And this seems quite depressing at first, I guess, if we think that means we don't have any influence over 85% of the world around us. But if we can accept it, and if we accept the principle that we can't influence 85% of what's around us, then in fact it can be liberating. and we can focus all of our energy on identifying that 15% and using all our strengths and assets and matching them up with that entry point. And that's something we talk about with our volunteers a lot, in terms of using their skills, their influence, their local networks where they really have the most influence. And as a change agent then, if you're having influence over your 15% and you're able to engage other people, well, their spheres of influence are different. And so this slide, I guess, also reflects the same idea of 6 degrees of separation, that we can build up influence over time, and it's the same idea that's captured in Malcolm Gladwell's the tipping point. With persistence, with lots of small incremental changes focused on our own 15%, they aggregate to build enough momentum to overcome the inertia of the status quo. And eventually you reach that tipping point, which allows a sustainable change to be secured. The next lesson we have is around chess, and the idea of re-expanding collapsed complexity to generate more options for action. And so if you'll remember at the beginning, Ali, when he first asked the tribal chiefs about introducing sports activities for girls, the situation looked a bit like this. A bit of a stalemate, no real options for action. This was a very, very conservative society in which for decades there's been no activities of that sort permitted for girls. Indeed, there are real restrictions on girls even leaving the house, leaving the tent. And so Ali thought on his initial inquiries with the chiefs that he was in this sort of situation. But only by expanding reality and thinking through different creative options, thinking what other pieces are on the board, can you begin to generate more possibilities for action. And I think this is very often the case in situations of conflict. The conflict becomes very polarizing, and the dynamics become oversimplified in people's minds, right down to black and white, you're with us or against us, that very binary or polarized view of the world, just like the stalemate of the 2 pawns in the center of the chessboard. And only if we can expand the view, allow people through facilitated interactions to gain a deeper understanding of each other and to begin to share different perspectives, to empathize and to build up a picture of multiple versions of the truth and of reality, then there are many more pieces on the board and many more options for action together. So I guess to conclude, in our work in social change, in situations of conflict and violence, we talk about our presence, our practice and our performance. And in social systems in conflict, we must be present for people. We have to be there for the long term. We need to build relationships of trust, and we need to listen to people. And we need to be present to be able then to respond adaptively to local priorities and emergent opportunities that may pop up along the way. If you're not present, you're not there to capture those moments. And in our practice, I think we need to let go of that A to Z linear plan and throw away the idea that we can influence 100% of the system. And we need to embrace multiple models and gain insights from each of them. And we need to try to support people to re-expand collapsed complexity of polarized conflict situations and polarizing communication. And in our performance is really that of a change agent who lacks any real power in the system, but who's able to perform a really useful role as a listener and as a facilitator, and to provide a safe container within which there can be activities in which people can broaden their vision, be open to new perspectives, and shift their attitudes and ultimately change their behavior. And so if we throw away that linear model, this is really the image that I think typifies this emergent understanding of change, the smoke and changing through colours over time. So that's a few insights from our experience in different places. Steve, I know you've got some very exciting and interesting slides to follow about large systems change. I'm happy to take any questions at all now, or we can continue and take questions as we go through the next slides.
Yeah, I'd like to take questions, I think, first, if anyone has any. Thanks so much. It made me think of many things in my own work, such as a basic tenet of community organizing is start where the community is, rather than where you wish it would be.
Yes.
And so understanding that, and I often use the quotation from Shakespeare about through indirections, find directions out. And always emphasize persistence. It's a really wonderful illustration. Peter or Matilda or Jay Sweeney, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I really have to go now. So I found it really interesting to listen to what you've been doing, and I really like the idea of obviously taking small steps to get somewhere, and that well, I think it's quite obvious that when you have a complex problem like cultural conflicts in camps like that, that you start from somewhere small. But still, it's obvious that also that you want to do a big thing, but you can't do that unless you take the small steps. So it's really, it was really good to listen to that, and I'm actually hoping that I can get some of my students to join in with these sessions later on in the other sessions that are coming, because I think it would be really nice to get them to discuss things like this and to get them engaged in these kinds of questions. So I'd like to thank you very much, but unfortunately I have to go.
No problem. I just posted an updated schedule of sessions too, so
all right.
Hopefully you can get that.
Okay.
Matilda, thank you very much for the feedback. Yeah. Great you were able to join us. Thanks a lot.
All right. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Mark, I'd like to continue on through the next slides, just to have a discussion with you about how this fits with some of the other change thinking. So if you move along to the next slide, that would be...
Yeah, sorry, there we are, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So this is what came out of our thinking about what different people focus on when they're talking about changing complex change. Some people focus upon individual awareness and orientations and understandings, perspectives, some upon technologies, such as climate change technologies, renewable energy, cell phones, being big about changes. Others upon social, political, economic structures, so the government, how we make decisions, etc. Some upon memes, values and beliefs, that's about what's ingrained in our society as core understandings, and then of course the natural environment. So it strikes me that you've particularly effective at focusing on the memes section, if I could suggest that, because you're really coming at it from point of view of shifting people's relationships and understanding about each other. So it does connect to the individual, but most people that focus upon the individual do it much more categorically. You know, they say, let's have some spiritual experience or something like that. So it strikes me that it's really about the memes and the values. I don't know how you might respond to that.
Well, I think that's great. I agree completely. I think if if we go back to that 4 dimensions of conflict model that we use, it's one of many different tools to have a think about categorizing conflict or violence in different forms. And in some ways, I can overlay that on this model here. So individual is obviously the personal dimension. And for us, conflict in the personal dimension can include really individual capacities to manage situations of conflict without resort to violence. But it's actually the individual capacity. But it can also relate to individual feelings of self-esteem or confidence. That's particularly relevant in the case of post-trauma and how to recover having been a witness to or a victim of violence or even a perpetrator of violence. So kind of a lot of things within the personal dimension. The structural dimension, I think, fits very nicely on your social, political, economic structures, because for us, it's all to do with issues of unfairness in different forms, unfairness perpetuated by different structures. They can be formal or informal structures. They might be written laws or unspoken rules of behavior in a community.
And in your case, I was particularly aware that you were in essence taking an intervention that changed the dynamics between the tribal leaders as well, or supported a different dynamic, maybe is the best way to say it.
So I think we believe our most important work is what we would think of as deep down at the level of cultural violence. So absolutely around memes and values and beliefs, and the kind of narratives of how those are developed, generated, and kind of it's a process of social construction. So they're continually being constructed and reconstructed and transferred. And what we can do to shift those narratives so there's less cultural violence. I think what I'm just wondering where to locate relational violence, what we understand by relational violence on your diagram. I don't know whether you would put it under memes, values, beliefs or under kind of the individual mode, but for us that's the difference between the personal dimension, which is very obviously in the individual sphere there. But it's about relations between people. So yeah, the ability to empathize and to understand another person's perspective. It's kind of a bridge somewhere between individual and memes, values, beliefs. I'm not sure which sphere it belongs to.
I would tend to put it more in the memes, values, and beliefs. But I mean, this is one of the things about, I loved your comment on all models are wrong and that's certainly the case with this, that there's obvious going to be limitations of it, and it's a question of developing it. I think that when people, I think that the genius in your approach that I really like is that most people that focus upon the individual level will focus upon the relationship with the other.
I think that's right. Yeah.
And so I would put it there. But the thing that is the genius is that you don't make that the big issue, right? Because many people just back away once you talk about having a retreat or once you talk more directly about these issues, and they can't handle it. But the way you've introduced it, it's not threatening to people. It's just emerges for them out of their lived experience. So I think that's really wonderful.
Well, that's really a good insight for you, because I think that's right. It's not explicit. It is experiential. And if you attempted to introduce it explicitly, you wouldn't get anywhere. You probably wouldn't even be welcomed in the community.
Yeah, and that's where I find the big hurdle is for many of the people about the explicitness, say, of the U process, for example, is that there's a huge hurdle that a lot of people just can't get over, is the explicitness of it. Thank you for that. Maybe we could move on to the next slide. And this is something that is very much in evolution. It's different than what we had in the journal article. But what I'm talking about here is trying to identify different change strategies. So one is around, so the components are what's the key piece here. There's a force that is has some power, and it's using that in ways that are tend to be confrontational, because they are taking on the need for the status quo. There's the forcing change power approach, which is really about organizing people in opposition to something that's currently is.
Yeah.
The creative power, or co-creating change, is the traditional collaboration. Let's get together and see what we can do together to make a change. And the controlling change power is usually trying to control the direction of change by minimizing it. Sort of the most modest thing that can be done. So when I just playing with these concepts, what I see you're doing is combining the supporting change and the co-creating change in particular. The supporting change being sort of the, the classic change agent, as you described them, somebody who doesn't have power, except their ability to sort of be persistent and have some sense of how to see the system differently. And then confronting it and helping people take action in that setting. So there is there is a clear sense of leadership in the supporting change strategy, whereas the co-creating change strategy is really about collaboration and having the change emerge, which is your overarching strategy, I think, if I can put it that way. So I'm thinking of the co-creating change as being the overarching change strategy, and sort of the supporting change might be more a tactical way to get to the co-creating. One of the things I'm trying to understand is the relationship between these strategies. That's why I'm just...
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I would agree. I think you could think of our volunteers as really operating in supporting change mode, in order that the people they're working with in the community can co-create change, and it's them doing the co-creation. So I like it. I think both dynamics are at play, and yes, in that sense, the supporting change is the tactical, and the co-creating is the ultimate kind of strategic approach.
So this is very useful for me, because I never thought of the supporting change in the way it's expressed itself in your particular case, of that being the change agent's role, to take leadership. I thought of it much more as sort of a traditional power person, like the noblesse oblige that I've got down here. So
yeah, so you're right. Kind of power in the sense that you have a slightly different role that might be unique. So the role of facilitator to construct a safe space.
Yes,
that is a certain type of power, and it can be very unique and valuable in a community, because nobody else might be able to do that. Yeah.
And I'm just thinking the way you do it, I personally identify with as well. I'm always talking to people and bringing them together to be able to do things, but I have no power. I mean, who am I? I'm some guy out there working, right? So I now think of myself in that term. So that's great. Thank you. Should we just take a look at the last slide?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So this is a complicated slide for most people to understand, but just to explain it slightly, usually we start out with the opportunity identification. That is, I imagine that's where you started, right? You started as somebody who saw that there's a different way to approach peace building than what people were doing. And then you start talking to people and building relationships with people. And we can see that's what happened in this very case, right? Your ally went into this camp and he had identified an opportunity. He took 5 steps back and then started doing the quiet convening, the relationship building.
Yes.
And then pulling together people in new ways, which is a key thing in system awareness, right? Making connections in ways that people had not thought of through the health program, for example.
Yeah.
And then creating, his was a very informal convening, right? It wasn't as though everyone got in the room at the same time, as I understood it, although that eventually did happen in the sense of the tribal leaders. But given it's such a fragmented society, that is, I imagine it's just outside of their cultural norm to say we'll have the whole system in the room. Would that be true? Thinking of the women and the men and the children.
Very much outside of the cultural norm, very much. So that, decisions very male dominated and quite a strict hierarchy within that as well. A lot of respect for elders and so on. But I think you're right. This is at the stage of, I think Ali's, in the systems awareness, Ali was doing his own kind of systems mapping of what are the priorities actually. Having the one before, he's had that learning journey of hitting the brick wall, and he's then realized relationships matter, and started quiet convening, which enabled him to do systems mapping of what are the real priorities, and from that emerged the need for a health program. And then the self-convening, I think, was at the first self-convening loop was around, okay, well, who's interested really in the health program? And so talking with the camp officials about a health program and getting permission to do that.
And then getting that as a prototype project.
Yes. Yeah.
Going systemic change outcomes, having the impact. Yeah. And developing a leadership network.
I think what's interesting, the leadership part where tribal chiefs are beginning to see what's happening. Ali didn't have personal direct access at that stage, but clearly the camp officials and the tribal chiefs were seeing what's happening and allowing it to happen. And the mothers were giving feedback to Ali that this is a really important and good program. And there were some metrics around health that were being assessed. So kind of after action review was looking at some of those metrics, which were feeding into kind of health reporting. And then scaling, I think, is relevant, especially where things started in one tribe and then were scaled up. And the idea of tipping points. Once a few people show interest, and more people want to get on board.
And then he repeated the cycle with the sports, right? After
I think so. Yeah, he probably went round it again with the sport for boys, and then again with the sport for girls. Yes.
So the wonderful thing about your case is how light and informal it is. Because when people look at this type of map and where that map has come from, it's come from an enormously heavy change process.
I think I get that, yeah.
And so for shifting people to understand, I mean, in one way you could say you've got a heavy change process because you've got this whole organization, Generations for Peace, right? But to shift that and think of how Generations for Peace is doing this, I imagine, in multiple locations with your networks so that people can articulate that as a light process, which is supported. In one way, there's different levels here, right? You're the backbone organization for this at the community, global community level. And then you're creating and inspiring this cycle throughout your network. So there's two different levels. It's useful to think about this. So That would be, and then I'm just thinking about the funding. Who paid for Ali?
Yeah, so that program was funded in part by our own core funding and in part by Olympic Council of Asia. So that's just one of our partners, obviously with a particular focus on the countries we're working in Asia. Mm-hmm. So, a donor, not a traditional donor, really, not a governmental donor, coming from the Olympic movement, the sport world. And that's, that was also explicitly why the original plan was Sport for Peace program, explicitly. Yeah. And of course, this is the solution. And that's why the Olympic movement is supporting us with Sport for Peace programs. But yeah, you're right. I'm looking at the other loops there. And because Ali's case is a very small case, if you look at some of the other loops, maybe that's happening for us, it's happening more at a kind of meta level.
Well, I'm thinking the action research in a way represents this story you've just told, right? And the chapter you had in the book.
Yeah,
that you've been able to identify and have raise new insights about how to go about this.
Even before that, we've Ali is still with us, and he's progressed and is developing up through our facilitation specialization as well. So he's been delivering training, and we're using his story as a nice example of this, what we mean by kind of adaptive programming, and not A to Z, but just A to B, do that really well, and then see what is around and choose where the next stepping stone is. So we are using his narrative already in many different forms in our own training. Similarly, the book and this webinar has really just emerged out of that. So.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking that he went through this cycle, first of all, with the boys and then with the girls. Mm-hmm. And so there was this systemic change outcome with the boys. You could say that that's action research in the sense that it's lived experience about people observing it, and has built new capacity for being able to then undertake the next cycle with the girls.
Yes. Yeah, and especially with the capacity of the other volunteers that are supporting Ali. Each time they implement something, they get better at it, and they learn new activities to do and new facilitation skills to perform them effectively. Yeah.
So I'm wondering do you have any sense of this type of analysis being useful in your own training programs, or is it just a level of complexity or complicatedness?
I find it very interesting. I think when we think of the level of our training and our volunteers, this is probably a level of complexity that would be kind of overkill for them. Mm-hmm. I think I remarked when I first saw it, what I find most interesting about this is the green funding loops,
right.
The funding arrows. And I think this is a really interesting slide to have conversations with donors around. So that's my personal instinct.
Yeah, or sponsors and donors and people who are looking at it from a different level. Yeah,
and in using it to try and kind of broaden their horizons as to why they may consider the importance of funding several different things. So, you've got opportunity identification there. So, scoping missions, things like that, capacity building, funding of that, separate from just funding the core programs, and also explicitly funding research. I don't know, the funding of research, whether it's action research or kind of goes back towards opportunity identification or feeds into the kind of evaluation of prototype projects. It's really hard for us to get funding for those things independently from funding just for a program.
Yes, I find in this work that it's all about learning and emerging new capacity in one way. And funders are somehow think learning's going to just happen without paying specific attention to it. and it just doesn't. And so they always talk about, well, what's happening on the ground? How's the change happening on the ground? Yeah, but if you really want to have the impact, invest another 5 to 10% in this other work, and you'll get 100% more return.
I need to introduce you to our donors, Steve. That'll be good.
Well, I would love to introduce you to some people too. I'm going to just stop the recording and invite people to come to our website, my website, networkingaction.net, to be able to look for more webinars. It's under the, let's see, the LSC book tab. You'll find the webinar schedule. So feel free to go there, and we look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.